Welcome to the Voter ID Laws and Voter Suppression panel. My name is Victoria DeFrancesco Soto. I will be serving as your moderator for today. We have two illustrious panelists, Matt Barreto and Zoli Heinl. They are really, really smart professors. Excellent. Look up their websites. You can see all of the fantastic work they have done, all their research, all of their books, but I am not going to spend time going through that right now. What I do want to highlight about Zoli and Matt, however, is that they are unique voices in the academy in that they bridge the research that they do and how people on the ground are affected, how voters are affected, how you and I are able to cast our ballot when we go and vote, and the research that helps us understand what helps the voting process, what hinders the voting process, is constructed by people such as Matt and Zoli, who are willing to leave their college campuses and engage with policymakers, engage with lawyers, and engage with citizens such as ourselves. So I think that this is the biography that I think is really important for the context in looking at Zoli and Matt's work. So that being said, today we're going to be looking at the recent spate of voter ID laws. And sadly, there's a long history of voter suppression in this country. I guess we could officially date it back to the passage of the 15th Amendment when African Americans were granted the right to vote. Shortly thereafter, there were mechanisms that were put in place to try to keep non-whites from voting. 1965 comes along, and it is a watershed. We are really able to make some dramatic inroads into the sanctity of the voting process and making it what it was supposed to be like in theory. It wasn't perfect, but huge strides had been made after the Jim Crow era that we had lived in the early 1900s. 1975 comes around, and we see an extension of that, and we keep seeing some extensions, but then we come to 2010. And we start to see pushback to policies that have been put in place to protect voting rights. And to be specific, 2010, which coincided with the year of the Tea Party Revolution, we see a number of laws that can be interpreted, because there are two sides to every story, but that can be interpreted as suppressing the right to vote, and in particular, the right to vote of minorities and poor folks. So 2010, we see this change in the political climate. Some would say maybe even a backtracking of advances that had been made over the course of 40 years. And then on top of that change in the political climate that came on the heels of the Tea Party Revolution, we see the Supreme Court strike down Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. So as we are entering an election year in 2016, and voting is again at the top of everyone's minds, we need to take a long, hard look at the voting process and what laws that maybe or maybe not didn't have the intention of suppressing the vote, what their effect is. Right? I can't read into the hearts of the policymakers over here at the Capitol, so I'm not going to theorize on that. But what we can look at, and what Matt and Zoli can look at, are the effects of those laws that have been put into place, and talk about what their potential effect is going forward, not just into the 2016 election, but the coming election. So with that, I am going to hand it off to Matt, followed by Zoli, and then I want to allow a good amount of time for a conversation with the audience and the panelists. Matt.
All right, great, thank you. Thanks for that wonderful introduction, Vicki. And thanks for you, those joining us today.
I'm going to talk about the voter ID law here in Texas. Gabe Sanchez and I, who's at the University of New Mexico, I'm at UCLA, we have worked on now 6 state voter ID lawsuit challenges in federal or state court. And Texas was the 3rd that we worked on. And we collected a lot of data, collected a lot of evidence, and I want to share with you part of what we put into our report that we reported to the federal court, and share some of those findings in terms of trying to put what Vicki just said, some of the real numbers behind what was happening, what we think. Also going to give you a little bit of just background in general. I don't have data points here today about some of the other states that we've worked on, but I'll be happy to talk about those elsewhere. Not surprisingly, it's been pretty similar. It's been a pretty consistent finding across the states in terms of who has the different types of ID and who doesn't. So let's start with the motivation for voter ID, which is vote fraud. The U.S. Senate Republican Party Committee in 2005 wrote that voter fraud continues to plague our nation's federal elections, diluting and canceling out the lawful votes of the vast majority of Americans. And so they had done this extensive report and drawn this conclusion that it was a really big problem. This sort of laying the groundwork for what Vicki talked about happening, which was the spate of voter ID laws. The U.S. Supreme Court found in the first voter ID lawsuit that went all the way to the Supreme Court, Crawford versus Marion County, this is in Indiana, that, quote, while the record contains no evidence that fraud, in-person voter impersonation at polling places, has actually occurred in Indiana, there is still, quote, a real risk that voter fraud could affect a close election's outcome. So the Senate Republican Party had come up with this report. They said it continues to plague our nation. In Indiana, there was 0 evidence entered of in-person vote impersonation. This is the type of fraud. Not to say that there couldn't be some fraud in elections, but the type of fraud that photo ID laws had come up with. So we have now what's more of a theoretical question, according to the Supreme Court here. Do states have the right to try to prevent fraud from happening at all costs, even in the face of evidence that no fraud exists? In the Indiana court, in the Indiana case, there was no evidence given of how many people would be affected. This is not a case that we worked on. There was no evidence given of exactly how many people did not have an ID. It was more of a theoretical debate, and that's what ended up with more of a theoretical discussion. So we want to know if voter fraud is not really happening, but is used. What is really behind voter ID? And what Gabe and I have said in this academic paper that we're writing is that it's a combination of 3 things, and I'm going to focus mostly on race today, but race, class, and partisanship. Voting regulations, as Vicki explained, voting regulations have been directly tied to the exclusion of African Americans since the 15th Amendment was ratified. Almost directly what you just said, Vicki. I think so.
I know.
We're on the same page here. If you go through and look from 1870 through 1964, we always try to be cautious as academics. We don't want to make sweeping generalizations, right? We can't find any examples of changes from 1870 to 1964 to voting laws, to anything, that were not specifically and directly designed to limit or deny African Americans the right to vote. Every single thing that was passed had the intent and purpose to limit or deny the African American franchise. So when we step back, we're not that far away from 1964. We still have this in the back of our minds. It's a motivating question for us as academics. Is this still happening? In Arizona in 2012, we just use this sort of a funny example, although it's real. The official Spanish language materials that the state of Arizona printed said that election day was November 8th instead of November 6th. They said it was a typo. And it may have been a typo, but it was only sent to people who requested information about the election in Spanish. And it was an important typo telling them the wrong day of the election. Right, so
and a later date.
And a later date, afterwards, not before. Not vote early, November 4th, but to vote on Thursday, November 8th. And so this sort of stuff, there's plenty of examples of this. So let's talk about how you measure voter ID and what is voter ID. And then I'm going to return to this discussion of whether or not this was racially motivated. This is one of the hardest things to prove in a court case. It was proved very convincingly here in the state of Texas. And then it was sort of thrown back down to the federal court judge to reevaluate that. They didn't say that she got it wrong. They just said, just make sure you're clear in what you're saying here in your ruling. You're saying in her initial ruling, she said that it was racial intent is what motivated the law. And that usually hasn't been found in other cases. And it was found here in Texas. And I'm going to talk about that. So what type of IDs are allowed? This varies dramatically across state. So there's something like 20-some states have voter ID laws now. And what that means is very, very different. Sometimes two states look exactly the same. Like, oh, they both allow this and they don't allow that. And other times they're dramatically different. Some are very forgiving, which they have a long list of IDs that you could use, or you can just sign an affidavit and say, I am who I say I am, I just don't have an ID. And other states are very strict. So it really, really varies across the state. One of the questions we want to know is who is the most appropriate pool of people to examine when we're thinking about voter ID laws. In some court cases, they only want to look at registered voters, people who are already on the voting rolls, and see how many of those people would be affected. Gabe and I like to take a step back and say, let's look at all eligible voters, everyone who's a citizen adult, because those are potential voters. A big question that comes up a lot of time in court cases is whether or not you actually possess the proper photo ID versus give me a count of how many people were turned away on election day for not being allowed to vote. We think that completely misunderstands the question, because if you don't have the proper photo ID, you may not go to the polls in the first place. So there's only a few number of people who go to the polls and then go, oh shoot, I don't have the ID, I got turned away. And so that's a much, much more conservative measure, and one that we think sort of decides the question. And so we ask the question, what is the best way to measure this? So what counts as a valid form of ID? A driver's license, pretty much every single state of these 20 or so states. Maybe Zoli has in his slides how many states have this. I don't remember. It changes on an almost monthly basis now. But driver's license, that counts everywhere. State non-driver photo ID card. This also counts pretty much everywhere. This is the new thing that they sort of invented about 20 years ago or so, that if you were elderly and you were no longer driving, but you still needed like something that looked like a license that you might use to cash checks and stuff like that. And so this is now the second most common. It's issued by the same thing, the Department of Transportation, the DMV, whoever it is. A U.S. passport. This does not actually count in every single state. It counts in a lot of states, but in some states it has to be a state ID card. A U.S. passport cannot be used. If you have a U.S. passport, you can't use that everywhere. It counts most places, though. And a military ID card. These are the things that pretty much, if you have these things, you can get in. In some states, a university ID works, although it has to be issued by a certain university, like a state university. If it's a private college, it may not count. The university ID might have to have an expiration date printed on it, which most university IDs don't have. A state or federal employee ID. This counts in a lot of places, but in many, many places, if you work for the federal government agency or a state department and they issue you an ID card, you can't use that to vote, even though a state agency has issued you that card. And a concealed handgun license. We all know, of course, there's Rick Perry. That's what you need to vote here in Texas.
Is that a real picture?
Yeah, that's a real picture.
You need a gun to vote?
Yeah, you can bring your gun in, actually. No. I think you can, because you can carry guns around now, anywhere you want. But a concealed handgun license, your handgun license is your ticket to voting here in Texas, but a university ID is not. In Texas, driver's license, so that was just a generic slide. In Texas, it's driver's license, a non-driver ID, passport, military, or gun license. That's the limit. Other state employee IDs or a university ID don't count. It has to have an expiration date on it, and it has to be unexpired within 60 days at the time you vote. This is another rule that is just bizarre, because there's no reason why your driver's license needs to be up to date to prove who you are, unless perhaps in the 60 days or so since your driver's license expired, you're now no longer the person you say you are. But in every state, and this is something that we find a lot of people, and this is what creates confusion, there are a lot of people that have expired driver's licenses, a lot. And so they think like, oh, I'm good, I got a driver's license, and then you take it out, and poll workers are trained to check that. Oh, sorry, sir, your driver's license expired, you can't vote. And name matching. This is one that creates a lot of confusion. Almost every state has this clause that says the name must substantially conform. And that was the case here in Texas. What does that mean? The name must substantially conform. If you have women that have multiple last names or then get married, and then maybe legally on some documents have a hyphenated name or an additional name? What if your other documents don't look like that? It's up to the poll worker. The poll worker at the front desk gets to decide whether or not your name conforms or not. And so this is one that creates a lot of confusion. All right, so let's return back to the discussion about what is really motivating voter ID. And I'm going to show you some evidence from our expert report for the state of Texas from our survey that we did. But to begin with, let's look at a lot of comments and quotes that lawmakers who have co-authored or solo authored these voter ID requirements have said either directly about voter ID or in some of their other efforts on other laws that they're working on, so that we can just sort of get a flavor of what's happening. And again, in our larger project, Gabe also have additional comments about class and about partisanship, but here I'm just going to highlight the ones about race. So this comes from a former Texas GOP director, Royal Massett, who said, HB 218, which is the Texas voter ID law, will lower voter turnout. There's no evidence on the record that non-American citizens have voted. So he's saying, same thing, there's no fraud. That would have been stopped by HB 218. HB 218 is a direct descendant of poll taxes and allowing only white male property owners to vote. He was one of the few Republicans who was against the bill, but during the time the bill went and gave this speech to the committee hearing the bill, saying why he was opposed to it, and basically just calling them out for being racist on the record. Here's a quote from the Pennsylvania Republican state legislator Daryl Metcalf that said, I don't believe any legitimate voter that actually wants to exercise that right and takes on the responsibility that goes with the right to secure photo ID will be disenfranchised. And then he says, as Mitt Romney said, 47% of the people are living off the public dole, living off neighbors' hard work. We get a lot of people out there that are too lazy to get up and go and get the ID they need. The individuals are too lazy, the state can't fix that. Again, he was one of the co-authors of the Pennsylvania ID law. What is he talking about when he says these people are too lazy, they don't work hard enough? Well, here's a quote from a representative in Oklahoma that sort of continues that thought, who was a co-sponsor of one of the voter ID laws in the state of Oklahoma. Are they in prison just because they're black or because they don't study as hard in school? I've taught school, and I saw a lot of people of color who didn't study hard because they said the government would take care of them. So almost just directly finishing the other thought, directly connecting this idea of people who are too lazy to get IDs to people of color and blacks. A couple more good ones here. This is from the state of Arizona. State Senator Lori Klein. This is not necessarily her own words. This is a letter that she read that she said she got from a teacher in southern Arizona, from a high school teacher. Sent her this letter and asked her would she please read it on the state Senate floor when they were discussing and debating an immigration bill. So this was in the context of an immigration bill, but Senator Klein was also a co-author of the voter ID law. Most of the Hispanic students do not want to be educated, but rather be gang members and gangsters. They hate America and are determined to reclaim this area from Mexico. If we are able to remove the, quote, illegals out of our school, the class sizes would be reduced and the students who want to learn would have a better chance to do so. Pretty obvious. Again, co-author of the voter ID law. And I think this is the last thing that we have. Yes, this is from, you probably remember this person. This is not a state representative, but is connected to Betty Brown, who is the co-author of the state bill. We'll return the last two quotes here in the state of Texas. This is Rebecca Forrest. She is an activist against immigration. If you want to know why we can't pass that legislation in Texas, it's because we have 36 Hispanics in the legislature. All of the states that have passed legislation have a handful. And I mean literally, some have no Hispanic legislators. Well, maybe 3 or 5 or something. So that's part of the problem. We need to change those numbers. We need to do something about that. Basically saying we need to get rid of, there's too many Hispanic legislators. And the state representative, State Representative Betty Brown, who eventually lost a primary challenge, said during the HB 218 Texas voter ID hearing, when a Chinese American who represented a Chinese American advocacy group in Texas came up and said, this name conforming thing is really going to screw with us because you guys always screw our names up. And you put our last name first sometimes, and he's giving this speech to her committee on the voter ID bill. And she says, rather than everyone having to learn Chinese, I understand it's a rather difficult language, do you think it would behoove you and your citizens to adopt a name that we can deal with more readily here? So that was all sort of a long way, starting and coming back with some examples from Texas. We have about 700 more examples like this. in our larger project to say we really think what's motivating this is race. We're not shy about saying that in our paper, and some that we've had critics who don't necessarily like us sort of pointing that out so head on, I guess. So how do we get that? The next section here, I'm just going to now run through the results of our study. How do we gather data to assess this? So we have some provocative quotes. As we said, some of these were from Texas. They were used directly in the intent section in the trial here in Texas. But we need to do more than just show some provocative quotes. So what we do is the survey approach. There's a lot of different approaches to gathering data on whether or not people have these IDs or not. So we use very, very precise questions, and we use tree branching. So we start with the basic question, do you have a driver's license? Every single person in our survey gets that. If you say yes, is it currently unexpired? We say take it out and look at it. Is it unexpired? When did it expire? Does your name substantially conform? We ask people, have you changed your name? Have you gotten married? Have you gotten divorced? Is the name that would be on the voter rolls the same as your name on your license? With some allowances, if they say no, we can assess why. Maybe they just have a nickname. Maybe they have their middle name with their first initial. Some of those things are technically supposed to be allowed to go through. Of course, it's all up to the discretion of the person at the desk. If they say yes to those things, they have an ID, then we go ask them some demographic questions and the survey's about over. If they say no, then we ask them about the other IDs. Those are just a very simple. Do we ask them, do you have a state-issued non-driver ID? Do you have a military ID? Do you have a U.S. passport? And we follow all of those up with questions about name conformity and expiration date. So we can assess whether or not they actually possess this ID and whether or not the ID that they possess would count. Would it work for them to be able to go in and vote? So we do surveys of the general public. We random digit dial to landlines and cell phones. We want every single person in the state of Texas to take our survey. We leave no household, no number uncalled. We do multiple callbacks to make sure that even the hardest to reach people who might be working at the hours we call each number back up to 10 times. So we call the general public, we ask them if they have ID. We can then assess their possession rates. What Gabe and I always talk about, we're not talking about what Zoli is going to talk about, which is actual turnout. We're just saying, do you actually possess the needed credentials to cast a ballot in the state of Texas? We can assess that by race, gender, age, class, partisanship, all sorts of other things. Some areas for attention, some questions that you should be asking us. Is there any what's called desirability bias? Because we're just asking people these questions. Maybe they're lying to us. We get asked this question when we present our data in court. You say, the desire to lie should go against us. That after we ask you these questions, eventually you should want to tell us, yeah, I do have that. I have a passport, right? The social desirability is to say, yes, I belong to society and I have these documents. There's no social desirability to say, like, no, I don't have a driver's license, I don't have a passport, I don't have these things. So we think to the extent that someone could be trying to change their answers to fit in, it would be working against us. Response rate. Certainly every single person that we call on the telephone does not agree to do our survey and talk to us. What if all of the people who hang up on us every single one of them has a license, and so we're underestimating that. So we do some things in here to assess that. Question wording must precisely match the law. As I said, all these state laws are extremely different. We want to make sure that the question wording matches. And finally, we need to protect the confidentiality of the respondent. In some ways, this is easy because we tend to employ a method called random digit dial, where we don't know who we're going to get till they answer. But in each case, the state wants us to turn over all of the records of everyone we interviewed so that they can follow up with them, even if we just give them the phone number. And we never do that. And in every single time, there's a little side hearing, or I don't know what it's called, and so far, the ACLU or the lawyers that we're working with have always won those, that there's a academic as well as a market research data collection expectation of confidentiality. But that's something that's very important. All right, so what do the results show? This is the percent of people here in the state of Texas who lack the photo ID by race. This does not include the name conformity issue, I should say. We divided it up. This is just objectively, they do not have the ID to vote. If we added the name conformity, each of those bars would go up a little bit more, because some of the people who have ID say, yeah, but then I changed my name. 4.7% of whites, 8.4% of blacks, and 11.4% of Latinos in the state of Texas do not. And this comes directly out of the report that Gabe and I presented in the VC versus Perry case down in Corpus Christi. So what does that look like? 184,630 African American citizen adults. That's a lot. 184,000. It's almost the size of a small city, medium-sized city. don't have an ID, who are citizen adults in the state of Texas in 2014 when we did the study. 556,000 Latinos. Citizen adults, and they don't have an ID, they don't have the photo ID enabled to, they lack a photo ID to vote. These were the numbers that we submitted to the court. In addition, among those people, we asked follow-up questions about, well, couldn't you just go get one? Remember that quote I showed from the Pennsylvania state senator? You're just too lazy. Why don't you just go, if you wanted to vote so bad, you could just go on Tuesday down to the place where they're handing out free IDs and you could go get one. So we asked a series of follow-up questions about whether or not each of these would provide a burden, and would it be a substantial or small burden. Having to request time off of work or school. Having to get a car. Most of these people don't have driver's licenses. All of them don't. So many of them don't have a car in their household. So they might either have to ride the bus. So it creates burdens. Even if the state is handing out free IDs, you have to bring your documents together. You got to go get your birth certificate. You need your official birth certificate. Official certified copy of it, not an official certified. And this is the number of people, so almost all of the ones that we interviewed, who said they lacked the photo ID and they would face barriers trying to get them. So, you know, it was 184 and 556, but it's basically 75% of the people who don't have an ID say, yeah, it would be really difficult for me to go and get one, or costly or burdensome. Not only that, but we see a very, very strong correlation to socioeconomic status. And not only a strong association to socioeconomic status here in Texas, but that is particularly felt by blacks and Latinos, who are much more likely to lack ID in the lower income category. So among people who are in the lowest income bracket, meaning their annual household income is $20,000 or less, 40% of blacks, 2 out of 5, and 40% of Latinos don't have an ID. And it's not entirely driven by class, because it's only 15.9% of Anglos. Now that's a lot higher than their statewide rate. It was 4.7. But even Anglos who are in this lowest bracket, right? If this was entirely driven by class, we would expect all these bars to be level. We would say, well, the real problem is just that blacks and Latinos are poor. But even when we look within class, we continue to see very strong, striking race effects. And why is that the case? So among people in this lowest income bracket, or among people who lack ID, 35% of blacks and 51% of Latinos, many of these are immigrants who came here after they already didn't have a high school degree, but only 10% of whites. So if you don't have your ID and you don't even have a high school degree, everything interacting with the bureaucracy gets harder. And the same thing, they're overwhelmingly low income. So 60% of blacks who lack an ID in Texas make less than $20,000 a year, and half of Latinos. That's their annual household, all the earners in the household put together, $20,000 or less. Many of those folks, those Latinos, live in the Valley, where, by the way, there aren't just free ID centers next door. In some places, you have to drive 100 miles if you live in the Valley, 100 miles to get your free ID. With your $20,000 a year income, don't have a high school degree, don't own a car, good luck getting an ID. So to get this free ID, I think I'm almost to the end here. To get this free ID, you need to supply some underlying documents. So the state says, look, we understand some people lack ID, but we're giving it away free to anyone who wants it. If you're a U.S. citizen, you just come into this office. Might be hard to get to, but you want to vote, you got to come and get it. Well, to get there, you still need to provide what's called underlying documents, like your birth certificate, your social security number, proof of citizenship, proof of identity. You need other types of ways to prove you are who you say you are when you go in and get your picture taken. And among those people who don't have ID, so those ones that would need to go there, over a quarter of them do not have their underlying documents. They don't have their birth certificate. They don't know where it is. Or they weren't born in a hospital. A lot of viejitos in the Valley weren't born in a hospital. They don't have a county public record birth certificate. Well, if you don't have that, they won't give you an ID. It doesn't matter even if the office is next door to your house. So there's some percent, and this was one of the percentages that was helpful for us, is that 26%, or about a quarter of the people who didn't have it, we were able to argue would basically never be able to have it under the current Texas standards because they didn't have those documents in order. They wouldn't be able to get them without facing all sorts of additional burdens of trying to track those down. So that's sort of the end of the data presentation. I'll take any questions at the end. Turn it over to Zoli now.
Thank you. You want to do it?
Thank you, Matt.
Okay, great. And thank you for the introduction, and thank you all for being here today. I think the two presentations go really well together. So what Matt's done is, I think, a phenomenal job of showing, number one, intent, and number two, showing how massive voter ID laws could have, or the consequences could be. And I'm going to look at sort of the next stage, which is turnout and the actual consequences of these laws for who turns out and who doesn't turn out. And the patterns are going to, not surprisingly, fit very closely to the things that Matt talked about. So just to make sure everyone knows, this is with a fine graduate student of mine, Nazita Lajavardi. So those looking for someone to hire at some point, remember that name. Okay, so motivation here is, again, basically the same motivation that everybody at this conference has, to understand who's incorporated into the political process and to see what barriers there are and to see if there's ways that we can overcome those barriers. As Matt talked about, and as Vicki talked about, we know that there are supposedly real and widespread threats to equal access to the vote, a proliferation of laws with voter access, limitations. 34 states have adopted some form. Some of those have been overturned in the courts. Thankfully, some of these are not yet in place. But the pattern is more and more strict laws. So increasingly over time, not just do you have to have some form of ID to get a provisional ballot, but you actually have to have an ID, and you have to have a strict ID, and then you have to have a photo ID. So we're moving more and more in the direction of more and more people being potentially restricted from voting. So half of the nation's population is potentially impacted by this. And I'm asking exactly the same question. So basically, is this about race? Is this about class? And also, is this about politics? So I'll talk a little bit more about politics than Matt did. But are minorities, the poor, and those on the left losing out? So we've talked, giving fair play to both sides. There are, at least on the face of it, arguments for voter ID laws. So these may serve to reduce voter fraud. These don't prevent legal voters from participating. Almost everyone has or can get an ID. The American public supports these laws, and they will restore trust in our democracy. So these are the reasons for them. Do with those what you will. I'm not going to really evaluate those in any way, shape, or form. There are also very strong reasons to be opposed to these laws, obviously. So they're not necessary. Argument, and the data really aren't there to show that there is voter fraud. It's impossible to argue that there couldn't be voter fraud in the future. But we have essentially no evidence of the voter fraud that would be prevented with these kinds of laws. And the thing that I'm going to focus on, and that matters as well, is these laws serve as a barrier to limit participation of minorities, the poor, and the political left. What Matt talked about is they have less access to IDs, and clearly showed that that's the case. What I'm going to talk about is, will they actually be deterred from voting? And there's a real question there, which is, are the folks who don't have the IDs, would they have turned out, or would they not have turned out? There's also a question of, would some people with IDs be deterred from voting just by feeling disenfranchised by the whole process? So if you feel like you're being targeted and they don't want you to vote, maybe you're not going to vote regardless of whether you have an ID. So there's a question about non-ID holders not voting anyway, and there's a question about people with IDs being deterred from voting. So it could be both less broad than Matt's talking, and it also could be broader than what the numbers that Matt is talking about. So we want to actually assess those. So again, we do already have lots of pretty clear evidence that voter ID laws could hurt racial and ethnic minorities and the poor. So as Matt talked about, lack of identification is acute, much more acute among the disadvantaged, among minorities. We also have some important evidence about discrimination in the application of these laws. So poll workers are disproportionately asking minorities for IDs. It's a small number of cases, but it's out there for sure. And in different ways, improper tally of provisional ballots. So they're not being counted in some cases. Again, it's a small number of cases, but it is happening. And then you also clearly have the pattern behind where these laws are being passed. So Vicky wasn't going to reach into the minds of those passing laws, and I'm not either. I'm just going to say the apparent political motivations. But these are being passed by Republicans, often in states with large black populations, and I think a lesser extent states with Latino populations, large Latino populations. So a lot of evidence that these laws could matter, but on the main question that I'm talking about, there actually is very little evidence that these laws have had consequences for who turns out to vote and who doesn't turn out to vote. So there haven't been a lot of empirical tests of this. Those that have been published on this have basically found, first of all, not much change in overall turnout, and then very few signs of differentially low turnout for minorities and the poor. So from what has been published so far, for the most part, we might actually conclude that these laws don't matter and that they're fine, and if they serve to increase trust just a little bit, okay, let's move forward. Even if they were racially discriminatory, the intent was negative. If the effect is null, then the arguments against them become weaker. So it's important that we assess the actual empirical consequences and turnout, I think, a little bit more closely. And there are reasons to be concerned with what's been published so far. First of all, I think one of the main ones is these studies, most of them occurred prior to the strictest forms of voter ID being put in place. So prior to 2008. If we find that it's only the strict photo ID or the strict ID states that have the turnout effect, if we were only assessing non-strict ID states, then we were assessing the wrong states and the wrong laws. So as these laws become more strict and more stringent, we might see greater effects. How past researchers have looked at this hasn't necessarily singled out strict states. So we might want to look at more recent data. We might want to look at strict states and separate them out a little bit. Also, if we just look at surveys and look at who says they voted and who says they didn't vote, we know that there's massive over-reporting of voting. We know that at times minorities over-report more than whites, although there's some dispute about it. But we really, if there's a 20-30% error rate in terms of surveys, it's harder to detect the effect of a state law. So we want to have good data on who does and who doesn't turn out to vote. And then lastly, no one's really looked at the political effects of these laws. So are they, as one might expect, given who's pushing them, are they helping Republicans and hurting Democrats? So we want to assess that as well. Our solution is relatively straightforward. We just have newer, better data than the folks before, which is, it's not rocket science, but it's important that we have these things. So we're using what's called the Cooperative Congressional Election Study. It's a nationally representative study and covers recent elections. So data here is from 2006 to 2012. We now have 2014 data that I'll be adding in as well. Number two, it has the validated vote. So each person who reports voting, the study goes back to the voter rolls and determines whether they have voted or not. If there's no match whatsoever, then they're dropped from the analysis. So it's not, if we can't determine whether they are or not a voter, they're dropped. But so the people who say they're voting, we pretty much know that they're voting. The people who say they're not voting, we know that they're not voting. So validated vote. And then critically, if we're looking at individual voters, this is a large sample, 40, 50,000 people in each year. And so you're looking at about 1,000 respondents per state. And so you can potentially get at minority turnout in an individual state. Okay, so the research design is a sort of a typical political science research design, which we're just looking at the turnout of individuals in states with strict photo ID laws and comparing that to individuals in other states. We're looking at both general and primary elections, and we can just look at that in the bivariate, and we will, and then we'll do the same thing, controlling for all the things that we think might affect turnout beyond strict voter ID laws. So other state electoral laws, the context of each election, individual demographics. I'll go over these again in a little bit. And then the factors that might lead to the passage of strict ID laws. And the key test is, does the turnout gap between whites and racial and ethnic minorities increase in strict voter ID laws, all else equal? And again, we're focusing on strict, or at least we'll start by focusing on strict voter ID laws, because we think those are the ones that really are likely to have the biggest potential to dramatically impact turnout. Okay, so what happens in reality across these years? Start with a simple test. We're not controlling for anything here at all. We're just looking at the validated turnout rates of different groups in different states. So you can look at the turnout of, okay, yeah, so we did get cut off here, so I didn't go actually look through my style. So here we've got general with strict vote, no, so this is general and then general strict photo ID, primary, and then primary strict photo ID. So I'll walk us through since it's not so easy to see, but what you see is that in strict photo ID states, Hispanic turnout is a lot lower than Hispanic turnout is in non-strict photo ID states, both in the general election, so you see the gap here, and in primary elections. You see a similarly large gap for Asian Americans, and somewhat of a gap for African Americans, at least in primaries, somewhat in the general election, and at least in primaries, and the gaps in general for whites are a lot smaller. So it looks like the turnout of minorities is going down a lot more in strict photo ID states than the turnout of whites is going down in strict photo ID states. So I apologize again. Just to reiterate, the black line is general election turnout for a group in non-strict photo ID states, and then this is the general election turnout in strict photo ID states. So the drop here is one could say is due to strict voter ID laws being in place in that state. And again, the overall story is much bigger drops for the Latino and Asian American turnout than for white turnout, and somewhat larger drops for black turnout than for white turnout.
Which election was this?
This is 2006 through 2012. Yeah, all agglomerated together. Okay, so it could be that those, just keep that here for a second, it could be that those gaps are real and they are driven by this one particular law in each state, but each of those states is different on all kinds of different dimensions, and so we want to sort of see whether controlling for other factors that we think are important, we get the same relationship. So, you know, laws, there are a range of state electoral laws that we think help drive turnout of the population in general and of minorities. So we put in the registration deadline, early voting, vote by mail, no excuse absentee. We look at the context of the election in that year in that state, so how much money is being spent, which candidates are actually on the ballot, whether it's open seat, region, so on and so forth. We look at each individual's demographics, so then we're now not going to just control for your race, but we're going to control for your class, home ownership, gender, a range of other different factors. So is race driving this difference, or is it more a function of class or something else? And then factors that lead to the passage of strict ID laws. So it may be, well, we know it is the fact that these are largely Republican states and they have different demographics. So is that driving the results that we see in the end, and not the strict photo ID law? Okay, so we run a regression. I'm happy to show you the table, although it's a little bit long, but happy to show it if anybody wants. And this is what happens. And again, the slides didn't go through. I apologize. So you've got the predicted racial gaps in turnout in states with photo ID law, strict photo ID laws, and in states without. So again, you're going from general, all other states to general strict photo ID laws, primary, all other states to primary strict photo ID laws. And this is the gap in turnout between whites and a particular racial and ethnic group. So you see that in general, in a general election, whites turn out at a slightly higher rate than Latinos after the controls that we have in here, right? So you've got a gap of about 5 points, which is probably somewhat reasonable given that we're controlling for socioeconomic status and a range of other factors. That gap more than doubles in strict photo ID law states. So you get a gap of 14 points. So whites are participating that much more than Latinos. And in fact, what's happening is whites aren't actually raising their turnout, but Latino turnout is going down considerably in those states. You see the same, essentially the same effect in primaries for Hispanic voters, with the gap between Hispanic voters and white voters goes up from a little bit over 4 to almost 18%. So a huge increase in the gap. So the representation of Hispanics in American democracy is considerably lessened in strict photo ID states. In general elections, you also see the survey asked about mixed race Americans, and you see that there's really no gap in participation in general between whites and mixed race Americans once you control for socioeconomic status in most states, but in strict photo ID states, you see actually a big gap between mixed race Americans and whites. And then in primaries, you see the same sort of pattern for African Americans, although somewhat more muted, perhaps, again, related to Matt's earlier conversation about the fact that African Americans are more likely than Latinos, and probably much more likely than Asian Americans to have these IDs, so they may be less affected. But you still see a significant increase in the gap in primary elections. So whereas the gap between whites and blacks is a little over 4%, it goes up to 8% in strict photo ID states. Something that I can't tell much about with my data is the question of whether the presence of Barack Obama and extra mobilization by, in particular, African American groups, but also potentially by other racial and ethnic minority group activists have reduced all these different numbers. So it could be that things actually could be that much worse if there wasn't a counter-mobilization to these strict photo ID laws. And that could explain why you don't see much of an impact among African Americans in the general elections that we're looking at here. That's largely speculation. What we're seeing in reality is that Latinos are falling behind whites pretty significantly in these particular cases, in both the general and primary, whereas you see more uneven effects for mixed race Americans and African Americans. Okay, so skip that, just saying essentially the same thing. Racial and ethnic minorities are, in our analysis, not the only groups to be impacted by strict voter ID laws. So it looks like the least educated and the foreign-born are also somewhat affected. So the foreign-born in some versions of the analysis were about 13% less likely to vote in general elections in strict photo ID states and 3% less likely to vote in primaries in strict photo ID states than in other states. And then some similar patterns for education. I'm a little bit more cautious here in that none of these results for status and for education were as robust as the results for race. So we're relatively confident about the race results. The other ones, I think we still need to do a little bit more work before we can say anything definitive. A couple different robustness checks just to sort of see if what we're seeing is real, and we think it's real. One is it could be argued that even after all the controls that we're looking at, it could be that these states that have strict photo ID laws are still just different in ways that are discouraging the participation of minorities, in particular Latinos. And so simply by controlling for the Republicanness of a state is not singling out all the negativity that's in Texas that may be actually unrelated to the presence or absence of a strict photo ID law. One way a little bit to get around that is to say, okay, if these states are extraordinarily repressive states, then it's probably the case that they're repressing Democrats and minorities. And so if you just looked at Democrats and you compare Democratic turnout in states with no strict photo ID to Democratic turnout in states with strict photo ID, so we're dropping all the Republicans and all the independents, and we're only looking at the effect among Democrats, we find that racial minorities are still falling behind. So Latino and black Democrats are falling behind white Democrats in states with strict photo ID laws. So it does seem to be very much a racialized phenomenon and does seem to be related to the strict photo ID, the presence of strict photo ID laws. We find no effect on other forms of participation that don't require an ID. So attending a meeting, signing a petition, none of those things are disproportionately affected in strict photo ID laws, which is exactly what you would expect. We do what's called a difference in difference method. So looking at the change in, say, Latino turnout in a state that has instituted strict photo ID laws for the first time, comparing that to the change in Latino turnout over the same years in other states. And we get essentially the same pattern. Even our data with our large number of cases starts to break down in terms of the small numbers there. So we have less confidence in that, but we're happy that those results are pointing in the same direction. Important next step was to say, okay, maybe it's not just strict photo ID laws, maybe it's strict non-photo ID laws. So you have to present an ID and particular IDs, and again, it does vary from state to state, as Matt's saying, but you have to present an ID, it has to have your name on it. Does that disproportionately reduce minority turnout? And we find, again, that in this case it does. So the turnout gap between Latinos and whites is estimated to be about 13 points higher in strict non-photo states. And here we get a more robust effect for African Americans, so the turnout gap between blacks and whites is estimated to be 7.5 points higher in strict photo states than the rest of the other states. So no other, if you try and break down a finer and sort of less strict laws into finer gradations, we can't find any other effects for turnout for anything other than these two forms of strict photo and non-photo IDs in our data, at least in any case. Are there political consequences to this? So given that Republicans are passing these laws, Democrats aren't passing these laws, you would think if Republicans are smart, if we believe they are doing this to advantage their own party, then you'd expect there to be effects upon those on the political left, and we find pretty stark political consequences. So Republicans and conservatives are significantly less likely than Democrats and liberals to experience declines in turnout when strict voter ID laws are in place. Democratic turnout drops by an estimated 8.8 percentage points after all the same controls in general elections when strict photo ID laws are in place. For Republicans, the predicted drop is only 3.6 points. So here you get the same kind of change in the gap. So this is the gap between Republicans and Democrats and the gap between conservatives and liberals. Again, general elections with no strict photo ID, and then general elections in other states. General elections with no strict photo ID, and general elections in other states. And you see that controlling for other factors, Republicans have a small turnout gap on Democrats, so a little under 3%, but that gap grows more than doubles in states with strict voter IDs. And also, conservatives have a slight advantage in turnout on liberals after controls, but that gap grows multiple-fold in states with strict voter ID laws. So these laws, just to conclude, these laws are clearly discriminatory. So they systematically reduce the influence of racial and ethnic minorities in American democracy, number one. And probably number two and number three and number four, very importantly. Maybe number five, these strict voter ID laws are partisan, so they systematically reduce the influence of Democrats. And as Matt talked about and as Vicky talked about, all of this is made more ominous by all the kinds of connections you can make to American history, and everything seems eerily similar to past measures and their effects on access to the vote, so poll taxes. And this all, of course, raises a broader concern about the suite of other kinds of reforms that the Republican Party and others are trying to push forward to reduce or limit access to the vote. So our recent efforts to reduce same-day registration, reduce early voting, reduce no-excuse absentee voting, are those having disproportionately lower effects on minority turnout? And that's something that we're working on. I'd say there probably are some effects in at least one of those cases, but nothing, I wouldn't report any numbers yet anyway. So far it's hearsay. And that's it for me.
Thank you, Zoli. Your presentations complement each other so nicely. You see how these ID laws can have effects at multiple phases of the voting process. I would also venture to say that these laws have an effect before the actual act of registration, that I think it leads people to not want to be engaged in the first place, to say, with this political climate, why am I even going to bother to register to vote, even if I have the documentation necessary to do so. So I also think it's important for us to think of the bigger picture of what these laws do to the political climate that we find ourselves in. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and open it up to questions. If you could please state your name, and if you're with an organization, if you could also state your organization. Alicia.
Yes, I'm Alicia Perez, and I'm the League of United Latin American Citizens. I wanted to ask, did you look at big states like California and Texas, with Texas strict voter ID laws, and I don't know about California, but with high Mexican American, with high Latino populations?
So Texas is not included in the analysis that I present. Well, Texas is included, but it's included as a non-strict photo ID state because their law is not introduced until 2014. So the data here was only to 2012. The other, Arizona for strict non-photo would be one of the large Latino concentration states. California is in the data, but it's in the data as a non-strict photo ID. So there's lots of Latinos in here. There aren't massive numbers of Latinos who are affected in this data set to the extent that there will be in 2014. And so that's why the 2014 data will be really important to look at because that will then include Texas.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess, and my point, what I was thinking was the constant, Latinos don't vote, their apathy, they, don't want to vote or whatever the reasons are, but there's always that criticism about we don't vote. And of course, this shows kind of that it's a little bit system.
Yeah. I mean, it's so. I think there's two levels. Yes, Latinos don't vote nearly at the same rate as whites. That's a fact. The more important fact is Latinos vote at roughly the same rate as whites after you control for the factors that determine everybody's turnout. So age, education, income, nativity. Once you control for that, Latino turnout is roughly on par with white turnout in most circumstances. So Latinos are not naturally under-participators, right? They are under-participating in context in which their vote is being suppressed, and they are participating less than whites, understandably so, because either the system is limiting their participation or they don't have the prerequisite skills that make voting easier, and so it's just natural that for whites as well as for Latinos, higher educated folks, higher income folks, voting is an easier process for them, and so they're much more likely to report voting. But Latinos are not under-participators by any stretch of the imagination in terms of natural tendencies, let's say.
Michael.
Michael Rivera, UT Austin. This question is for Zoli. How does the CCES define people of mixed race, and what's your intuition about that effect? Because that was like the largest effect size between whites and mixed race.
So it's one of the so it's self-identified race, and so you can say I'm black, I'm white, I'm Latino, I'm mixed race. So it's just it's a small population, so there's probably a larger error bar around those estimates. So I wouldn't, with any confidence, say the effect for mixed race Americans is larger than the effect for Latinos or even African Americans. There's a significant effect for that group, but actually comparing across one minority group to another is difficult to make a conclusive statement across minority groups.
Could some of those people be black and they're just
Yeah, they absolutely. Yeah, I mean, so nationally, that's going to be I think the largest group. Well, one would predict that that's the largest group in the yeah.
But you don't know in your survey whether or not.
We don't know
say
what
if you grouped them with blacks, you could make the black results probably stronger.
Yeah,
but you would have to know that they were.
Yeah, and you could make this. You know what the national figures are, and you could assume, you could apportion. I mean, that would be pretty hard. But
you can do that. But yeah.
Can I ask a follow-up? So it doesn't ask mixed race and then like what races?
No. So that's all you got.
Interesting.
So I'm Maritza de la Trinidad. I'm at UTRGV. It's clear from both of the presentations that number one, the voter fraud fear is false. It's because there has been no historical evidence of voter fraud or dead people voting.
But there could be in the future.
There could be, yeah, just like someone could commit a crime, but you don't arrest them and send them to jail because you think they're gonna commit a crime. So how can this be used and for, you know, in policymaking, legislators, because this is clear data that shows both the effects and the idea that there is no voter fraud and that that's a false pretense. Can it be used? Is it going to be used?
I think, this sort of evidence, both the evidence that Gabe and I have on different states and Zoli's evidence sort of comparing across the states, just calls into the need more of what I had asked to Luis on his panel yesterday of what is our best chance and how can we return to some sort of national standard on this? And maybe we won't get the revised Voting Rights Act passed or whatever it's called, but we can't allow the states to have such divergent requirements for voting when we now know with the data that those things have real impacts and racial impacts. And so there's a need at a minimum of some federal standards to come back into place. Maybe it's amendment to the Help America Vote Act. Maybe we don't call it the Voting Rights Act. But there has to be something, because right now the strategy is, on a state-by-state basis. Perhaps, and I think Luis and Ari commented on this yesterday in terms of the makeup of the court as well, perhaps one of these lawsuits will go to the Supreme Court, and in the way that we now have national recognition of same-sex marriage due to a court decision. The danger is that we've only had one voter ID law go to the Supreme Court, Crawford versus Marion County, Indiana, and they decided in favor of the states and said even though there's no fraud, the states can do this. Now, they didn't have the evidence of the impacts yet that the Texas one does, and the Texas law appears that it will go to the U.S. Supreme Court. The worst case scenario, though, is that the Supreme Court says, yeah, actually overturns the decision and says Texas can have a voter ID law if they want to, in which case we're back at ground zero. So, Zoli, I don't know if you have a different perspective.
I guess I'm maybe more naively hopeful with the courts, right? So this data, at least to me, maybe I'm so partisan and biased, but it seems pretty conclusive, and so it seems hard for the courts to be able to say, ignore this data. So I view the courts as the most likely arena to move forward, whereas given national politics, I'm not sure Republicans who are the majority currently in the Congress, both the House and the Senate, are going to be supportive of any of the things that we're talking about here. So without a radical change at the
well, as you said in your presentation, all the laws have been passed by Republicans.
Right. So
it doesn't seem that they would pass a federal law to undo what they're doing at the state level.
Seems unlikely. Seems very unlikely. So I'm pretty.
When you go from the state legislature,
Oh, maybe.
you get smarter.
Do you? I don't know.
So I'm not very hopeful at the policy level outside of the courts, and I agree with Matt that there's a risk in the courts.
If I may, and I know we have a number of community activists at this conference and perhaps in this panel. It is what it is, and these laws are on the books. Maybe the courts will do something. Maybe in the medium to long term, the state legislatures will change these laws, but it is what it is. So what are we seeing different organizations do in terms of mobilizing to overcome these barriers? So we talk about voter mobilization to register people to vote and to turn out the vote, but what about taking that step back and helping that 25% that you indicated, Matt, here in Texas, that doesn't have any of the documentation necessary to start that process? Are we seeing any concerted effort to target these people and say, you don't have the necessary documents to even start the process, so we're going to do a targeted effort there? Maybe there's just not the interest. Maybe it's too labor intensive, but that would be a question of mine, because I don't see things changing in the near future.
Can I ask you a question on that, Matt? So did you ask if people knew much about the laws and what IDs they needed? So
yes.
You can definitively say who has an ID that's legitimate according to the election laws and who doesn't. But most people do people know, and are there a lot of people who don't know what they need and may have what they need but are uncertain and therefore are not?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. So we ask always is before we get into any of the battery, we always ask people right at the beginning of the survey. We first ask them if they know that their state has an ID law. We've started to see those knowledge rates creep up. But it still certainly isn't everyone who even knows they have their state has an ID law. I think when we first started doing it,
Very small overall?
it was about 35%, and it's up to over 50 now. I think there's just been a lot more national discussion and state discussion of these laws, but still, there's 40-ish% of people who don't know. Some of those people are guessing. But then after that, we always ask them a question that says, given that Texas has a state voter photo ID law, do you currently have the proper photo ID to be able to vote in Texas? And across every racial group, it's always 98 or 99% say yes. And then what we do is we have the people who say yes, and then as we go through the battery, because they don't realize that an expired ID doesn't count, or they don't realize that they work for the State Department of Health and they have an ID card. They don't realize that doesn't, or you have an AFDC card, or you have, a WIC card with your picture on it. Those don't count. And so I think that raises a larger point, maybe even related to Vicky's point, that if we end up with people who don't have the proper ID, they don't know the state has an ID law, or they do, and they're like, yeah, but I have something that I can show on election day. They may not see that urgency to sort of fix it. It really would be up to the advocacy groups.
And I'm thinking back to 1994 in California, where you started seeing the push to get people naturalized, and then eventually they registered, and then they voted. It was a long process, but it was a process that started, that was sparked, obviously, by SV. I'm not going to get into this. Luis.
A political science question and then a larger public policy question that I'd like all three of you to consider, anyone in the audience. The political science question is, has anyone shown whether or not any of this has mattered in any particular election? That is, extrapolating, and I understand the extrapolation, that would be necessary, right? But if you take the average decline in turnout, and you look at what turnout was in the election, look at the margin of victory of a particular set of races, would someone else have won if the voter ID law wasn't there? Counterfactual, if you will.
Yeah.
Just to get some further sense. Again, not definitive, a lot of assumptions, right, and so forth, but it does make it even more real than the two of you have helped us understand it in a nice way. The policy question is, why isn't anybody advocating for a national ID card that includes with it automatic voter registration? The solution's fundamentally simple. Not that the politics, not that the courts would challenge it, but we don't have to reinvent the wheel. Countries around the world have solved this issue of having the necessary identification to be able to vote, have done it for generations, and it's pretty simple. You have a national ID card of some sort, right? And you then include in receiving that card automatic voter registration, which would have more of an impact in increasing participation for everybody, potential, for everybody, than any of the stuff we might do ever through the courts, than any revised Voting Rights Act or anything of that sort. And we can't even begin a discussion along those lines, it seems to me, in this country. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on
I think you
whether
couldn't.
you would support that and still be able to.
I would not support
Would you
that
consult,
without movement on immigration reform, because you don't want to be in the business of handing out American ID cards to people who are U.S. citizens. So I think that creates a whole separate issue with what we're trying to do on immigration reform right now, and what it would lead to. If you could package that into a system.
The counter to that. The counter to that is you have more voter registration. I understand the challenges of immigration, but you would have such an explosion of voter registration, you could get comprehensive immigration reform.
Possibly, yeah.
Wait, can you elaborate on that?
Well, I don't think we want to be handing out, I don't think we want the federal government handing out cards that say you're a card-carrying American citizen, because if someone else doesn't have that card, and if everyone is supposed to have the card, then it just makes it so much easier to identify people who don't have the card.
And to have the disparities that the two of you just described.
What do you mean?
You're willing to accept the disparities in actual voter turnout of citizens,
Yeah.
right?
It would
Because of the
certainly,
potential impact that it would have on non-citizens.
It would certainly elevate-
Everybody to be heard. But that's the reality of the policy positions that we generally, as a society, have staked out right now.
it would certainly elevate voter turnout. There's absolutely no question if we had automatic. I mean, you would have to trade it for automatic registration and these things that some other countries do have. it would certainly increase, and you probably could see sweeping changes in the political landscape within 4 years, I would imagine. So I think if we had immigration reform passed and we didn't have a lot of people who would be without any sort of card at all, that I would completely want to work on that. So I just would be nervous if we did it first and hoped for the best.
Well, you just think of the possibility of combining the two.
Sure.
And I just,
The middle ground between those is driver's license, right? Because some people can be undocumented, get a driver's license or get some sort of state ID, and then just have automatic enrollment. So it'd be sort of, instead of having such different cards like a national voter ID, everyone has a driver's license. Not everyone, but in some states you can have a driver's license.
the only problem with the state-by-state approach is a lot of states won't, 30-some states will probably not want to have automatic registration with, you know, so.
Has to be federal.
Yeah, if you want a sweeping change, it has to be federal. Just quickly to answer the first question,
Oh.
I don't think anybody has done that calculation. I think that is an important next step calculation to do.
Yeah.
It flows directly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that with this upcoming election and looking at swing states, that would be particularly interesting
Absolutely right.
to look at that. And on the second point, Louise, I just don't think there's a political taste for it in this country. Like you said, well, look at the rest of the world. If there's one thing Americans don't like, is being like the rest of the world. It's American exceptionalism. So I just, even progressive types or independents, I think they would say, oh, an ID card.
And we're willing to allow the poor and ethnic racial communities to suffer.
And I don't disagree.
So the fact that we don't bring it up
Mm-hmm.
is our complicity with that disparate consequence.
On that point, James?
Yeah, just to answer your question on, at least partially, on what some groups are doing, the .idtexas.org is one thing that's put out just to kind of provide some level of education. Groups like Texas Organizing Project do a lot of voter education part of it. Of course, Texas is not small, and so the scope of what needs to be done is kind of huge. So I think there is those cost-benefit analysis on that, but at least there is some efforts to answer your question on by community groups to do that education at least.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, James. I think David and then Maritza.
No, well, Vicki raised a good question, raised a question about the literacy. So that they don't know that they could have the proper ID. So is there any type of educational, because this seems to also be an issue of education about the political process and, you know, the types of IDs you could have, and they may have it and they just don't know it, but this maybe voter literacy. We have financial literacy, we have, you know, all kinds of literacy programs, but
I think
perhaps
that,
voter literacy would be.
I think that's going to be what James
Is that-
was referring to,
Yeah.
just a more general voter literacy,
Yeah, right, exactly.
voter literacy campaign.
Some states have tried, some advocacy groups have tried to force states. So you really only need this in the states that are pushing strict voter ID, right? So out of those 34, let's say 16 or so are strict, or 12 or something like that. And so those states are not inclined to want to spend money to, they only begrudgingly give out these free photo IDs. And even those, they have them at very limited places. If you see what happened in Alabama, they closed all of the ID centers in rural counties that were majority black. And so some advocacy groups have tried to come in and say, okay, now that you have this ID law, we need to add more literacy. The problem is that the advocacy groups don't want to make that negotiation during the passage of the law, because then they're sort of on board saying like, okay, well, if you're going to pass the law, let's at least try. They're putting all of their eggs into don't pass the law basket. But certainly now that we have these laws on the books in some places, if the Supreme Court upholds them, then what the advocacy group should do is not only continue what James is saying, but they should then go and lobby the state legislature and say, we need to do more voter literacy, voter education. People need to know, now that we have this ID law, how do they get it, what are the hours, what forms do they need, what are the loopholes, all that sort of stuff. Right now, the state doesn't even want to really tell you any of that information.
Oh, I guess about the idea of the national ID card. I mean, I sense that it might sort of eliminate some of the disparities that you've talked about with the sort of the strict enforcement with, or the strict voter ID, but I just don't know if it would sort of really increase much beyond that. I mean, certainly I remember reading about some of these kinds of studies that do like what ifs, like what if we had elections on Saturday, or what if we had like automatic registration, or what if we had ID cards. My sense is that these things don't really sort of move the voting turnout rate all that much, since voting seems so structured by SES, and even when we've had lesser requirements, like in the 80s or in the 90s, we had turnout rates of about 50%. So, I mean, I'm just wondering, like, if you want to make the case for sort of ID cards, I guess we want to keep it grounded in what political science has to say about how these things really affect turnout. And I feel like it might not be that large, but I could be wrong.
So one of the issues is that registration, I mean, even before you put in the other controls that Zoli was talking about, among registered, turnout is fairly similar.
Fairly even.
The question, though, I think that David is raising is that those are people who have chosen to register or who have registered. What happens if you dump in a bunch of people who don't really want to be registered or aren't taking the steps to be registered? Now the response would be, well, now you're on the voter file, so we can contact you.
That's right.
And we can send you lots of information. Whereas if you're not on the voter file, then I'm not going to send you any mail, I'm not going to send you any texts, emails, anything like that. So they probably will turn out at lower rates than the people that self-select to register, but even if they turn out at 10%, there's more votes than, I don't know.
Yeah, well, I would say 2 points to that. So we know that mobilization works, and we know that minorities are mobilized at much lower rates than whites, and partly because they're not registered. So if you can get the targets for the mobilization right there in front of you, so some of these people wouldn't go to the polls on their own. Many of them probably wouldn't go to the polls on their own, but if they're actually mobilized, we know that people are susceptible to being mobilized. Knock on their door, and there's a significant increase in turnout. Would this radically alter the racial and ethnic demographics of the vote? Depends what you mean by radical, but would it be enough to, going back to Luis's question, alter key outcomes in key states? Potentially, right? We'd have to do the analysis.
Earl.
Yeah, Earl Bart, two questions. One, even though there hasn't been voter fraud, 2008 there were at least a lot of reports of voter registration fraud. Did that lead to any of these laws and change the political climate? And then second thing, and this gets back to the partisan stuff, to the extent that it is partisan and people are trying to suppress the Democratic vote, but have accidentally repressed some Republican vote, let's say, or conservative, keep it conservative, liberal if you prefer. Have you seen any carve-outs in these laws, let's say, in terms of the elderly, if elderly are more conservative, to relax the strictness of the law such that it wouldn't harm the conservative vote as much?
Have you seen anything?
Almost all of them have exemptions for people who are in nursing homes and things like that. Many of them have exemptions for vote by mail. And if you vote by mail, you don't need to submit an ID. Although in Alabama, if you vote by mail, you have to scan your ID and put it in the envelope with your ballot. But they only have like 4% vote by mail. It's almost all entirely polling. So there usually are exemptions to some extent for another for people who are not just over a certain age, but in some sort of condition that can't vote. But I think the best evidence is just that there hasn't been a single democratically controlled state that has passed a voter ID law, a strict voter ID law. Not one. They're all entirely being passed by Republicans. So it's not really a good governance issue. I mean, that's almost all the proof you need from the slide on that.
So in answering the first part of your question, I don't think fraud is what's driving this. So Republicans realized that this was a way to effectively increase their influence over elections, and they're looking. So they're anything that smacks of fraud, they're pulling it out. And whether that fraud is anything that would actually be related to photo IDs doesn't really matter. It's just the notion, trying to get the notion out there. So the fraud is not driving this. The fraud is finding instances of fraud is a consequence of this.
But I think that the rhetoric doesn't hurt. So if you're a lawmaker in a Republican-controlled state and you want to get this legislation passed, it's easy to point to, what was the organization?
Acorn.
Right.
You point to the videos.
Mm-hmm.
God, those are horrible optics. And it can't hurt. And so I think that folks need to be extra careful because that more conservative forces are always going to be on the lookout for any excuse to increase the barriers to voting or to further the fight against potential voter fraud.
And that raises one other thing, which not just educating voters that could be affected by these laws, but educating the American public. So currently, 80% of the American public is in favor of these laws. I think if people knew the partisan and racial consequences of these laws, and if people knew accurate measures of voter fraud out there, that potentially, though, that 80% could go down to 50%. I'm not saying it will go down below 50%, but you could have maybe more opposition to these laws at the legislative level than you currently do.
I mean, my sense is, isn't it true that that the majority of minority groups support voter ID laws, and maybe even at very high rates, like 70 to 80%, not just for the overall population?
On a simple up or down question, yeah, I mean, the questions are worded so.
How are the questions worded?
They say, do you think people in the state of Texas should have to show a photo ID in order to vote? Or the state of Texas passed a law that says you have to show a photo ID to vote, you think that's fair? And it doesn't say, and a state report found that 500,000 Latinos would not be able to vote. So, I mean, almost
that education
anyone
needs to be there.
So, I mean, we've split balloted that, and as soon as we did it in Florida when they were doing the purges in Florida. We have some questions in 12 on that. And when we just asked, like, do you think the state should have the authority to, evaluate the rolls and remove people they suspect are non-citizens, even, it's not 70%, but there was a majority of Latinos who were like, yeah, I guess the state, and then when you say, and when they did this, a report from the University of Miami suggested that 98% of the names removed were Latinos, and 98% of the ones they removed were actually U.S. citizens. Then no one supports it. So you just have to give them like a couple of pieces of information, but it's so hard to do that in the...
Right, and that's the sort of thing that gets picked up in some reporting.
Yeah.
Sometimes you see the statistic that minorities support
Right.
ID laws.
Well, they use that here. I mean, there was the UT Tribune polls.
But one thing that I remembered was just that I remember I was thinking, well, what you really need is some kind of natural experiment or some kind of thing that happens before and after, and maybe there's not natural ones, but I remember the motor voter law, since I'm old enough to remember these things. And this was supposed to be, and Republicans thought this was this Democratic effort to pack the polls with Democrats who would come to the polls. And as it turns out, it really didn't have much of an effect at all. It maybe made blue states a tiny bit bluer, and it maybe made red states a tiny bit more red, and battleground states stayed battleground. It didn't really seem to have the kind of systematic effect that people did. So maybe there's some kind of learning that can go on from what happened and why it happened during motor voter and why that was such a partisan issue. And then it just sort of disappeared because it didn't seem to have any systematic effect on party politics.
Let me get one more question before we all right, two. We'll let me get both questions,
Okay.
and then we'll let the panelists finish it off. Yes, sir.
All right. Doug Geib, I'm the Director of Voter Registration in Travis County. And curious, I know it's on minority votes, but is there any evidence of college, university students being voted with the voter ID?
I mean, they're definitely. Oh, go ahead. Sorry, we're going to take the questions. Write that down.
So with Motor Voter, if I remember, I think it was just providing the option to register, right? So that's why it's still taking a step further, rather than the national ID, making it automatic that when you get your ID, it still would be a federal law rather than a state law, and that would potentially have a different change than just having the option to register.
Okay, thank you. All right, gentlemen, we'll give you the last word.
I would say it's certainly targeted at students because most places try to take university IDs off the table as a proper ID. So, you have these state institutions. Why a state institution can't? So the fact that they try to purposely exempt university IDs makes me think that it's clear. In New Hampshire, they exempted student IDs. And the GOP speaker of the state legislature in New Hampshire said, quote, students lack life experience and just vote their feelings. Voting is liberals. That's what kids do. It's foolish. And that was when he was...
Just because it's true doesn't make it wrong.
That doesn't mean they shouldn't vote. That's true.
I didn't say it wasn't true, Luis. Anyway, he said that while discussing whether or not they should allow University of New Hampshire IDs. And that was his justification. So you can't get more obvious than that.
Well, I was in Virginia before here and saw the ID implemented there in Virginia. And, you know, Virginia is a very swing state.
Very.
I saw you know, the college campuses were ground zero for trying to get a lot, especially the out-of-state students coming into the state. To
register, that's right.
And so I think that's probably a part of that pushback.
Yeah, and I looked a little bit at age. It's hard to isolate like cases like that of out-of-state kids in a particular state, and you know what happened in terms of their registration. I didn't see a lot of age interaction effects with strict voter IDs, but I think it's a little too early to make a conclusion.
We usually find a curvilinear relationship with age. I don't know if you modeled it that way.
I didn't model it well enough
because
to make anything.
The youngest and the oldest groups have the lowest rates of, at least on possession, not on turnout. So we found that in almost every state, that we break out our results by like 10-year age brackets, and the 18 to 28 and then the like 75 and over have the lowest rates of ID possession. And then it slowly starts to inch up, and then when you get into like 38 to 60, those have the highest.
Well, and back to your comment about looking at ways, you know, identifying that 4% that doesn't have the documentation. When it was implemented in Virginia, that's the first thing we did is we looked at, okay, you know, the state does have this, you know, ID that we can give the voter, and we targeted people that might not have ID, went to those in a strategic way to try to help them get the ID that they needed if they didn't have one on its own list. So that's a great idea here.
Yeah.
How hard was that? I mean, what did you have to do?
Well, we went to retirement homes and took, it's different in Virginia than here, but I mean, you can, it's just a matter of looking at who the groups are.
Okay. Well, if you could all join me in giving a round of applause for Alex.